I'd like to express my sincere thanks to Tina Kitasheli and Civic IDEA, as well as Synopsis, for the invitation to share some ideas with you today. I wish I could be there with you in person, but hopefully this will be possible next time. The subject of this conference, Small States in the Changing World Order, is an extremely timely one. Your focus on issues such as successful resilience building and identifying new ways of competing on a more hostile landscape for democracy are so vitally important. This is because today, big authoritarian states, often under the rhetorical cover of pursuing a multipolar world, seek to create an environment in which larger states use coercion and aggression to subjugate smaller ones. Russia's full-scale attack on Ukraine is the most ghastly and violent example and is part of a pattern from Moscow that's including armed conflict-level aggression over the last 15 years in settings that include Georgia and Syria, in addition to Ukraine. To translate what the authoritarians have in mind, a world that is multipolar would mean one where the leaderships in Russia, China, Iran, and in other such repressive countries aim to shred the last remnants of human rights and democratic accountability, where big states are freer to smother smaller ones in their spheres of influence, where states that essentially operate as international organized crime syndicates export strategic corruption and kleptocracy as a tool of political interference, where information manipulation is the norm rather than freedom of expression, where official power can surveil without limits all aspects of everyday digital life, and where unchecked authoritarian state power feels at liberty to take down just about any figure or organization that's perceived to pose a threat to the authorities. And in an era of transnational repression, this means both within and beyond borders. This is a grim vision indeed, but we should be clear-eyed about the authoritarians' governance preferences and what kind of world we'd live in if such a grim vision were to be fully realized. The fact is, we've already entered into a dramatically different, discernibly more hostile environment for democracy and human rights, even from the perspective of 10 or 15 years ago. In historical terms, this is a blink of an eye and speaks to the speed with which these changes have taken hold. I would contend that part of the reason such changes have accelerated and grown roots is due to a number of crucial asymmetries that have taken hold over the last generation, and authoritarian powers have come to enjoy. Some important patterns have emerged that are worth paying closer attention to, and given the shifting center of gravity globally, democracies and democratic institutions will need to address crucial asymmetries if we're to set ourselves on a different trajectory. For some context, I'll start by mentioning an excellent paper authored this July by Tina Kitasheli and Ani Kinsurishvili, dissecting the pieces of the Georgia-China strategic partnership that attracted attention this summer. In their analysis, they detail an arrangement in which Georgia, a country of just under 4 million people, is seeking to engage with China in a sweeping set of political, economic, people-to-people, media, and cultural-related deals. But as the authors suggest, the Georgian system, like so many others, isn't equipped to reckon with the full implications of such comprehensive engagement with the Chinese party state. The Georgian example is simply one of many around the world in which a smaller country must contend with the vast range of tools and resources brought to bear by a massive authoritarian power and whose knock-on effects almost invariably corrode democracy and the integrity of independent institutions. This isn't to suggest such efforts by the authoritarians are seamless or perfect. They're not. But in such conditions of asymmetry, one in which Beijing's integrated networks of influence reinforce each other, countries around the world often are outmatched in bilateral one-to-one relationships with a large predatory power, at least to the extent such individual countries are unprepared. But beyond the raw size advantage enjoyed by the likes of China or Russia, in other key respects, the decision makers in Beijing and Moscow are enjoying serious advantages by virtue of asymmetries that have taken shape in a number of crucial domains that are central to democratic development. I'll touch on each of these relating to information, technology, and money briefly in turn. The first is the sphere of information. deep knowledge asymmetries exist in many countries around the world about the Chinese system under Xi Jinping or the one in Russia under Vladimir Putin. It's important to say that many of the participants in this conference have been at the leading edge of the response to shrinking these deficits, but there's much more work to be done. To the extent steep knowledge deficits persist, especially in places like the Global South, they'll continue to confer an important advantage for the regimes in China and Russia. On this point, writing in the new Journal of Democracy book, Defending Democracy in an Age of Sharp Power, about the United Front Work Department and other CCP systems, Martin Halle observes that those who encounter these entities are not entering into a spontaneous relationship with Chinese counterparts whom they meet in person, but with a hidden yet formidable top-down bureaucracy that's beyond the ability of most people in open societies to understand, because they have encountered nothing like it to serve as a point of reference. I'd also note that within the modern information ecosystem, authoritarian powers use secrecy at scale to advance their power and interests. Secrecy, which is about the control of information, offers a competitive advantage to the autocrats. Autocratic regimes operate at home on the basis of secrecy. And today, to the extent possible, Beijing and Moscow rely on secrecy to achieve their objectives beyond their borders. So for instance, when the Chinese government entities make agreements with foreign governments or businesses, they often demand that the details be kept secret. Russia's corrupt networks and proxies around the world typically operate in the dark. And such secrecy at scale, when unchallenged by governmental and non-governmental organizations, afford the autocrats another critical and often lopsided advantage. This is a systemic issue. The result of this pattern of engagement based on concealment is a gradual erosion of global norms of transparency and open government and the rise of new ones of secrecy and opacity. We're seeing this trend play out in real time right now across the globe. And asymmetries in the media domain are arguably among the most lopsided, affording authoritarian powers crucial information advantages. Russia and China in particular have deployed massive outward-facing media capabilities that are able to curate content to suit the political preferences of leadership in Moscow and Beijing. Narratives projected by these media initiatives increasingly are aligned with each other. For its part, China is building a media bridgehead in sub-Saharan Africa, and the effects on the local media ecosystem there remain poorly understood. Russia also has built out its media sector engagement in Africa as well as Latin America, all too often to the detriment of these regions' stabilities. Russia and China alike continue to exert influence in this domain across Europe and North America. It's worth noting that the leading authoritarian powers enjoy the benefits of message and narrative concentration. For pluralistic and often fragmented democratic powers, such message concentration does not come easily or naturally, and represents another asymmetric advantage for the autocrats. The effects of this global authoritarian media onslaught aren't just theoretical. In the context of Russia's horrific full-blown war in Ukraine, far too many audiences outside of the transatlantic democracies have bought into the Kremlin's distortions, which Chinese state media have readily amplified around the world. Let me say a word now about technology, which in today's world is of course intertwined with information, but also transcends it. Pervasive technologies that were widely thought to offer advantages for greater freedom instead are affording ambitious leaders in Beijing, Moscow, and elsewhere potent tools of manipulation and control. The digital revolution has helped flatten the global operating environment for authoritarian powers, affording them opportunities to exert influence at scale. New tools make it easier for authoritarian regimes to manipulate and surveil their populations and to help anti-democratic forces in other countries do the same. A massive injection of surveillance capacity over the past generation has been integral to the digital form of transnational repression pursued by autocrats. In key respects, autocracies have already aligned modern technology with their values. In essence, the powerful technological surveillance model that's come to predominate globally lends itself to the application of sharp power. That is to say, to enable the monopolization of ideas, suppression of alternative narratives, and exploitation of partner institutions. Finally, a brief word about money, about which much more could be said, but would go beyond the scope of these remarks. A global financial system vulnerable to kleptocracy and its networks also favors the autocrats. Reflecting on Russia's kleptocracy, journalist Oliver Bullough has observed that in the aftermath of the Cold War, as Russia benefited from global money flows, rather than liberalizing, it took to invading neighboring states, assassinating critics abroad, and engaging in systematic political warfare. And over time, it was the ability to move money quietly and seamlessly around the world to dodge taxes, scrutiny, and accountability that allowed the oligarchs to amass vast fortunes and project influence abroad. Here, too, the non-transparent transnational nature of the offshore financial system has afforded an asymmetrical advantage. So in essence, the arrangement of large parts of the modern critical infrastructure for democracy often tilts in the direction of the autocrats. Objectively, democracies should have natural advantages relating to informational, technological, and financial flows, but seem all too often to be systematically disadvantaged in these domains. In other words, the world has become flatter for the authoritarians. Making this challenge even steeper is the fact that authoritarian powers increasingly collaborate. As Ned President Damon Wilson recently observed earlier this year in testimony to the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, quote, "With Russia and China at the vanguard, authoritarian powers have grown increasingly more assertive and ambitious. And in an era of global interconnectivity, these autocrats recognize that keeping their own citizens in check no longer is enough to cement their power, and so they're partnering with other like-minded autocracies to share ideas, resources, and technologies," end quote. So I recognize that with this group of participants, I'm preaching to the converted. But the challenge for all of us is to encourage a different mindset of vigilance across open societies and their critical institutions. We've not yet achieved this goal. So what should the basic elements of a response from the democracies look like? Although the world may have become flatter for the authoritarians, it mustn't necessarily be this way. Authoritarian state power, while formidable, is not invincible and has its own vulnerabilities. The full range of democratic societal power, when applied intentionally and systematically, is more resilient and potent than the grim alternative on offer from the autocrats. Democratic societies need to recognize the advantage afforded to the autocrats by today's asymmetries and respond accordingly. This means taking measures to shrink the authoritarians' advantage and, where possible, turning the situation toward a democratic advantage. This will require a far more intensive and systematic effort to inform, educate, and empower responses and action, and do this for the long haul. Democracies and their key institutions won't be able to adequately respond to a challenge they can't properly situate. If you don't understand something, then you can't devise a sound plan of action to address it. All too often, democratic institutions and their leaders have placed themselves at a disadvantage, either through complacency, willful ignorance, inadequate preparation, or some combination of these. So, if the fight is going to be brought to the autocrats and their asymmetries reduced, democracies will need a decidedly different scope and quality of preparation. This will mean dramatically upgrading local expertise, knowledge, and information about China and Russia. Democratic governments and non-governmental organizations must do a more comprehensive job of explaining the problems that result from Beijing's and Moscow's secretive and often corrupting practices. A clearer understanding of the downsides of engagement with the authoritarians and their proxies will help countries avoid making choices that compromise democratic integrity, thereby reducing the autocrats' competitive advantage. In this regard, civil society has a crucial role to play. A civil society sector that's knowledgeable on and alert to the risks of engagement with global authoritarian powers can contribute to greater transparency and informed policy making, and ultimately serve as a vital line of defense that reinforces the institutional integrity of democracies. While there's much more to say, and I expect that you all will be taking these issues up over the course of the conference, let me say a word about the global media environment. The democracy's approach to media also requires fresh thinking. Writing and defending democracy in an age of sharp power, Edward Lucas observes that free societies are losing the battle of ideas with authoritarian regimes not because democratic ideas are weak, but because the battlefield is skewed against them. On this count, authoritarians have used their toolkit to build out formidable global media enterprises that have particular traction in the global south. Democracies will need to invest far more effort and resources into media-related initiatives that can meaningfully compete with the already well-developed authoritarian media infrastructure. And finally, let me conclude by citing the final two sentences of the final chapter from our new book. Deep into the second decade of the global authoritarian resurgence in which unfree regimes are projecting their standards and values into the wider world, policymakers and citizens in free societies must be clear-eyed about what's at stake. Unless democratic societies rise to the challenge by leveraging their inherent competitive advantages, innovation, free expression, openness, and accountability, the challenge to democracy will continue to mount. Thanks so much for your attention.